Yeah, so I was going to try and make this one a bit more of a... Oh, all right. So it's time again to look at my face on the internet, but with a different gentleman's face. I'm very bad at these introductions. Hello, everybody. My name is Piotr, and this is the Global Gambit, and this is the second stream. I think this is the first time I've done a second stream on the weekend, but I think Syria is something that is worth covering because of the fallout it has for so many different countries and people, communities. And if you haven't seen all the videos that I've done on it in the past week, I recommend you go and watch some of them. But there was one angle which we touched upon in one of my episodes with a guest called Amy, who was talking about sort of the Kurds, and we touched upon a little bit about statehood because that's her area of focus as well. She's got 15 years of experience. But there's another gentleman who actually has a YouTube channel, and he's an expert on statehood and sovereignty and international relations, and that is Professor James Ker-Lindsay, who I'm sure many of you know, and I'm delighted to have him back again to talk with us more in a more formal. I want to interview the professor a little bit more because I would really like to hear his nerdy academic experiences and insights on what he thinks could happen to Syria, and whether or not it would stay a singular state. Could it be a federal Syria? Could we see the Kurds maybe try and seek succession? How does this all fall into self-determination? Some big questions, and none of this is this is all obviously hypothetical, but I think it's worth considering because Syria largely is, if you look at a map, good 33% or so of the country is dominated by the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the Kurds, and then the rest is obviously HDS-led coalition, but the Turks control or have the Syrian National Army in the north, and we've now got the Israelis, IDF, who are controlling certain sort of inlets, if you want to call them that, into the country. So there's a lot here to break down. And James, thank you so much for joining. How are you getting on?
Yeah, all right. I think it's obviously been a bit of a crazy time with everything that happened. I mean, the idea that just a month ago, Syria was in this situation that everyone thought, well, Assad had pretty much consolidated power. There were these little outlying areas, and then I think, like everyone else, the speed at which this has happened. And actually, I should say that where I'm talking to you from now, so I'm based over in Cyprus. If you go about 80 miles, 120 kilometers that direction, the next landfall is Syria. So it is remarkably close, and Cyprus has obviously been sort of very acutely aware of the issues and has been dealing with refugee issues like so many of the countries in the region. So it's something that's been felt very, very strongly where I'm talking to you from this evening.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the chat here, guys. If you do have questions for both of us, or particularly for James, then do drop them in. But what I'd like to do really is talk a little bit about Syria as it currently is, the sort of the composition or makeup of the different actors that have been involved and could be, not just within the country, but also obviously Turkey is going to be very pivotal here. Maybe the Trump administration, which I did a video on with Amy, which was very interesting. And then obviously the Kurds and then go towards more of the internal sort of fragmentation. So when you step back, James, and look at Syria as it is, it's I think, the most modern, complex, current, global conflict that we've seen, right? How many actors were involved? The Russians were fighting with the Americans against ISIS, but against one another for Assad. So when you, with your background in statehood and self-determination, when you see Syria, what comes to mind for you, and how do you sort of dissect it?
Well, I mean, there's actually sort of several, there's lots of big issues, but there's also actually a very interesting immediate question. So as you said, I deal with things like recognition and statehood and how states break apart, how they come together, how they're recognized, all these sort of things. But actually, there's a really, really interesting question at the moment, which is even before we get to the questions as to whether Syria will stay together or what sort of restructuring it could go through and things like that, there's actually the fascinating question about how do you recognize the legitimate government? And this is, I mean, it sounds like a really arcane area of international law, but it actually has quite a lot of significance at the moment for several reasons. So this used to be something that countries would do a lot, that when governments changed, either, you know, through coups or revolutions or whatever, they used to agonize about, do we accept this or not? And then there was a period really in the 1960s and 70s where more and more governments said, look, let's not really get involved in these sort of areas. Let's push them to one side. We'll recognize states, but we won't get into the business of recognizing governments, because then we've got to constantly be making judgment calls after everything that happens. And it sort of constrains our you know, ties our hands on what we can do. So, for example, Britain actually went and stopped doing this in the 1980s. It said, right, okay, we just won't bother anymore, you know, not after elections or after coups or anything. People can guess how we feel about governments from how we interact or don't with them. Syria is quite interesting because when the civil war broke out, what we actually saw is a move towards a little bit of that idea of recognizing governments, but it wasn't quite as formally legalistic as would happen in the past. So what you saw is that the Syrian rebels were accorded the status of the legitimate voice of the Syrian people, which was effectively a lot of Western countries saying, look, we're not going to de-recognize the Assad government, but we're not going to continue to recognize it, if you like. It's going to fall into a limbo. The people that we see as being the real voice of the Syrian people are the rebels. So fast forward to where we are at the moment, you've actually got a rather interesting situation in that HTS, which is the lead group within the forces that overthrew Assad, is actually classed as a terrorist organization. So there is actually a rather interesting challenge that exists here of, is it going to be recognized as the legitimate government of Syria? So for the meantime, there's a transition. And this is something that's been talked about. And this whole question of recognition of governments, as I say, it sort of rather fell away, but it's become much more significant in recent years. Because, of course, the other place that we've had these debates is the Taliban in Afghanistan. So they haven't actually been recognized as the government of Afghanistan. And a number of countries are trying to use that as leverage to try and get them to moderate their behavior. Now, it hasn't happened so far, but that was the hope. So it's going to be quite interesting to see in the case of Syria. So even before we get to these questions about fragmentation or restructuring the state, how is the international community going to respond to this new authority that exists, this new transitional government? How is it going to respond to HTS? And as I say, you know, it's not just that this is a question that the European Union, Britain, United States have argued that HTS is a terrorist organization. It's actually been through the Security Council. So this is a really high level. I've already seen these questions that are coming out in terms of sort of European policymakers. I noticed that Keir Starmer was asked, what was Britain's position on this going to be? So there's actually going to be some interesting discussions on how you deal with that, even before you get to any of the other things.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest questions around this is whether or not Syria will have whether there'll be a reversal in the recognition, if you like, of some of these groups. You mentioned the British government. I remember that there was an article within the day that HTS took control of Damascus, that the UK was already beginning to review its status of them. So has the US, I think, taken steps to delist them potentially. The UN, I think, would have the biggest impact on that because of potential sanctions relief. I don't know if they are fully sanctioned, but UN sanctions, multilateral sanctions are much more comprehensive than unilateral ones. But on this point of the UN, is that we've got two, I think, competing almost potential transition plans emerging. The HTS group have basically said that, you know, we're already implementing and undertaking a set of changes and an agenda, which, you know, if you guys want to be a part of that, quote unquote, you gotta hurry up and be a part of that. But at the same time, you've got, I forget the resolution number, but you've got resolution, whichever it is, that was established in 2015, I think, by the UN about some kind of post-Assad Syria. And obviously most people, I think the international community, whoever that is in this case, want that to be the benchmark, the framework that is used. Could you take us through how would that work? Would the UN system and the international community basically just accept what the rebels came up with because it was proven to be already too far in that they can't sort of change it to meet the UN requirements? Hey, can HTS just reject the UN framework and do whatever they want? Like, you know, help me understand.
You're in a really complex area, as I say, when it comes to this. And this was precisely why countries in the past said, look, we're not going to get into the game of recognizing governments, because they just didn't want to have to be in that situation. Because on the one hand, you're dealing with issues of state sovereignty. And there is obviously a lot of international parties are very happy to see the end of Assad and the back of him, but there are genuine concerns about what the implications are going to be for Syria and for the wider region of this organization, which of course, you know, had its roots in al-Qaeda. Now, you know, a lot of people would say, well, it's moderated its behavior in recent years, that it's in the areas that it was able to control, that it actually focused on effective government more than anything else. And so this sets a good model for what will happen in Syria. But of course, there's a lot of skepticism about that. People are rightfully asking, well, is that going to be the case? So what we're actually now seeing is, as I say, this idea that you could perhaps use this as leverage in the way that they've tried to do, as I say, again, unsuccessfully, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, because, you know, everyone thought, well, maybe the Taliban had changed. They've been a bit chastened by the fact they've been out of power for 20 years. But of course, they've come back and they've introduced all the measures which, you know, had been so controversial in the past. So whether this is going to be something that works is a very good question. Then you're also going to get in potentially areas of high politics. So you might have, for example, the Western countries, and remembering, of course, that Trump's going to be coming to power in about a month in the United States, and that means all sorts of interesting things can happen that would probably not happen under Biden or Harris had she won. That, you know, I think the human rights element probably would have been stronger, but certainly for Britain and France, as you know, European countries, there will be this question of, do they condition the ending of the UN designation or their own designation on steps that are taken. Now, of course, in the UN Security Council, it doesn't come down to just the fact that it's Britain, France, United States. Of course, you've got China, you've got Russia, and Russia, of course, has interests in Syria that have now been challenged. There's questions of the bases, the naval base that exists. So conceivably, could we see a situation where Moscow is actually saying to the new government in Syria, well, look, you know, if you want international acceptance, if you want to be formally recognized as the government of Syria and enter into the UN in that capacity, then, you know, we're going to have to talk about, you know, how the bases are going to be. Now, that might not mean that the bases get to stay there, but there could be sort of guarantees of security while they draw down from Syria. So, you know, it could be quite interesting, the sort of conditionality that's placed on the new Syrian transitional government and whatever comes after that in return for getting the goodies of being sort of fully accepted on the international stage.
Yeah, I do want to preface for anyone wondering, this isn't straight vodka. I made this joke with Constantine when we streamed yesterday. It is water, but I wouldn't blame Geir Pedersen, who is the UN Special Envoy for Syria, wanting to have some blunt vodka, given the situation he's having to deal with for Syria. I'm being tongue-in-cheek, guys, but you get the sense. It's pretty intense, the situation. And we definitely, to make another running gag referenced here, we definitely have more than a concept of a plan, don't we, James? Because I want to define the specific resolution. So it's resolution 2254. And this conversation we're having, James, is, I think, pretty dense. It's pretty, you know, academic. It's about international law. It's not just sort of well, this is what we'd like to see. So the resolution, I just want to go into it a little bit more specifically, because it is a resolution that was agreed upon or put forward the idea of some kind of process steps that would be including a ceasefire, which is obviously not relevant now, free elections under UN supervision, and inclusive, quote, Syrian-led political transition. So those sorts of areas, I think, are the biggest question, because Yolani, or the head of the sort of the face of this anti-Assad movement, right, is he going to be willingly stepping aside as the sort of de facto leader, and then holding elections eventually? Right now, we've got this caretaker prime minister of the group. I forget the name of what it was called in the north. That was the Government of National Sovereignty or something. I think it was managing the Idlib area that the HTS area had controlled. So I was just wondering, in your perspective, James, like, if HTS doesn't look to hold elections, if they hold elections outside the permit of what this UN resolution would call for, would they just be largely dismissed and seen as not illegal, but like, you know, just not unofficial? And so who would the UN recognize in that regard? Well, they wouldn't necessarily.
Well, so one of the things we often talk about UN recognition, the UN doesn't recognize anything. Well,
is
you
that
know,
why
the Security Council can say it can take positions on things, but ultimately these questions of recognition are about state sovereignty. So it means countries are free to make their own decisions. And the reason that's important, of course, is because the Western countries can say, well, we aren't going to recognize this unless X, Y, and Z. And you would hope that because this is subject to a Security Council resolution, other countries would follow suit. But you might well have a number of other states that say, well, we are going to recognize them. And the UN might have set these conditions, but we feel as sovereign states that it's more beneficial for us and maybe for Syria or for the region to engage and recognize them. So what's going to be very interesting in all of this is how is the Arab League going to respond? Because that obviously is the main regional organization that one would be talking about. And what we had actually seen is that, you know, very early on in the civil war, the Arab League had taken the position that Assad should show restraint in how he was dealing with the protest. And of course, he didn't, and it led to the civil war. And so Syria was suspended from the Arab League. It was taken back in May last year. And that was a very important sign that effectively everyone thought that Assad had effectively won, that there was a pragmatism that was seeping into the Arab world where they were saying, well, look, you know, we're just going to have to deal with him, and it's better to have him around the table in those discussions. So it might well be the case, and it's going to be very interesting to see the debates that we're going to see amongst the Arab states as to whether you know, which are going to be the countries which are going to break ranks first. And maybe as the League as a whole says, well, look, you know, we have our concerns, but it's better to be engaging with this government than marginalizing it and having it as, you know, an actor that we can't control because we're not really talking to it and we're not trying to welcome it. So, you know, and I think we have to be very clear. I mean, all the signals suggest that there are a lot of Arab states that are extremely worried about the transition. I mean, they don't like the instability that's right on their doorstep, but they also have those concerns about the past of HTS and what it, you know, has it really gone beyond that? So they will be concerned, but in these cases, several of them, or maybe many of them, could well turn around and say, yeah, but we feel it's more beneficial to engage with them and try and bring them on side, try and moderate their behavior in that way. So all this is to say that it's at several different levels that when you start to deal with these issues of recognition, that it actually becomes quite important. And regional organizations can be very important and crucial actors in determining how the wider international community develops. Because if the Arab states start to do that, it's more likely that more and more Muslim states will then say, well, we will also recognize. And at that point, the pressure starts to grow in other countries. And even the West would probably start to turn around and say, well, can we fight the tide? Is it beneficial for us to be fighting the tide under those circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I defer to you for more of these specific things, but I having worked in UN for the few years that I have, I feel I can add a bit of points here. Blue Sky's comment about the UN no longer being relevant. I mean, I get that sentiment. It's largely what I hear 95% of the time, because people see my bio and Twitter and they're like, oh, he's an idiot, he worked for the UN or something. But you see, and you mentioned it at the beginning of the chat, and it's an example, a comparison, which I think is incredibly pertinent here, which is the parallels with Afghanistan. Obviously, there's also Libya in terms of what could happen next, and very much what we don't want. But Afghanistan is an example where sort of when the Taliban took back control, there were no countries that were willing to engage with the Taliban on an equal footing. You don't have any ambassadors. There's no official embassies present in Kabul. You have what's known as the Shah d'Affaires, which is the second in command, but they don't carry the same diplomatic weight and significance of a full-scale ambassador. And no country, I think, wants to be the first to take that step in the case of Afghanistan, right? The Russians don't want to be the first to be sort of normalizing a terrorist organization or something, or whatever, a very strongly minded extremist Islamist group. I know the Taliban is in Al-Qaeda, but anyway. But there was one entity that was the only entity that could talk to the Taliban, and that was the UN. So when we've got lack of humanitarian supplies, lack of stability, there's only one entity that will take up that kind of slack to engage politically, humanitarianly, in a security basis, right? I don't think Syria is going to be as bad necessarily. We have a more defined security situation. The general geopolitical architecture around Syria is, I think, a little bit less, it was more conducive, I think, to some kind of more defined. Is it favorable? No. I'm still worried about Syria, parts of Syria being a breeding ground for extremist activity. But the UN does have a role here, because what's interesting from context I've been hearing in the Security Council is that there is an appetite to ensure that Syria gets some kind of political transition, whether that's full-fledged elections or, fair and free, well, as in influenced. Even the Russians seem to indicate that they want some kind of clear pathway forward. Why? Because they have the bases in Western Syria, and therefore it's crucial for them and integral for them to get some kind of Syria that is stable, because if they don't, then they could be pushed out, and then their broader geostrategic situation is screwed. So I think that we could see a UN backing of this quite smoothly, and I'm hopeful. I'm not pretending to know who's the best people placed to lead the post transition, but I'm very hopeful that we won't see our anarchy like we have in Libya. But I don't know, James, to talk about Libya for a second and comment on anything else I just shared there, do you think, what's the risk that we could see a Syria type, a Libya type thing happening in Syria, or are the circumstances just too different?
No, I think this is absolutely what everyone's worried about. I mean, we have seen these examples. I mean, the two that really stand out is Libya and Iraq, of course. That seeing what happened to Iraq after Saddam Hussein fell, and I think one of the positive things that we have seen is very quick steps to try and put in place a transitional government. And appointing somebody to serve as prime minister to oversee that, that's a very welcome sign. But I think anyone watching this is going to be extremely concerned about the fact that, there is all the potential in the world that, HTS has emerged as this group that very few people knew much about. Obviously the key Syria watchers knew about it, but and they were certainly on the radar of governments and the UN, because, as I say, they've been put on this list as a terrorist organization. But they're certainly not the only factor in this. And I think what we see in a lot of these other situations is that could it be the case that other factions then turn on them? So we're thinking very much at the moment that this is the end of the civil war in Syria. But there is, and I know it can come across as rather doomsday-ish and sort of promoting that sort of view of things. But there will be the worry that there isn't going to be the stability in Syria, that there are other factions, and can this hold together? And that's going to also come down to these sorts of debates about elections. And of course, when you hold elections, that is also a time of real concern in these sort of situations, because you've then got to get buy-in from the defeated side. There will be losers in that, and how will they feel that they have lost? And so what you then have to get into is sort of quite complex debates about how do you make that as inclusive as possible. So you could say, well, look, we've got a transitional government at the moment, but the transitional government is to transition to a process of maybe drawing up a new constitution, and that will be an inclusive process. And then we'll have elections. So there's actually a number of different steps that you can take in these sorts of situations to try and stabilize it. But it is very precarious. There's no doubt about it. And I think there will be a lot of concerns that, we could see sort of Syria descend into the problems that we saw in Iraq, and we've seen in Libya equally.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to break down a little bit more, actually, go into some concepts briefly, because then I want to sort of start thinking about, different hypothetical scenarios. But, this is the end of a 14-year civil war, largely speaking, that has fractured Syria along ethnic and religious lines, right? It's a very multi-faith, multi-ethnic country, whether you've got, let's just a broad overview, Sunni Muslims, the Shiite Alawites, if I'm saying that right, the Christians, and then the ethnic Kurds, and that is, I think, Andrews,
and
yes.
It's a very, you're absolutely right. It's a very, very diverse country. I mean, predominantly Arab, predominantly Sunni Muslim, but certainly not exclusively so.
And I think what's interesting is why Iran is the biggest loser in this, the absolute biggest loser, is because it's lost its access to the Shia Crescent, which was a concept I hadn't heard of. But it's basically this area that goes from the Levant on the coastline through sort of Libya and is sort of across down through Syria, and then obviously towards Iran. And it's something that Iran has tried to leverage, a bit like sort of Russia tries to, use the excuse that it's protecting ethnic Russians in the Baltic states or in Ukraine or in Moldova, for example. Iran has tried to leverage that it is the defender and protector of all Shia Muslims, right? So I think it's very interesting to see how we're going to see this change in Syria's political geography or makeup, right? But I was very interested, James, if you could, with those sorts of points in mind, could you explain the different types of options Syria could have? Because it could be a federalized country. Could it be a co-federation? Could it be could you break down what kind of options Syria could have, and whether or not some would be more realistic than others?
Well, I think you absolutely sort of, hit the nail on the head with sort of saying, one of the potential options is that you federalize the country. And that would certainly be sort of more beneficial in terms of dealing with the Kurdish area. I think the problem that you run into is that, if we're to put it very bluntly, there isn't a tremendously good experience of democracy anywhere in the Arab world. If we're going to be very, very blunt about it, I mean, in recent years, the most promising country was Tunisia, and that even has gone down a very authoritarian path with its president. You would really be, for that, you would be really sort of thinking very much about remaking Syria in this very democratic image. And actually very pluralistic. And what actually becomes very interesting is when you think about federalism and you're talking about the area in the northeast, which was is the Kurdish area. I mean, they've been running a fascinating experiment in democracy up there. I mean, I think it's, from what I can tell, it sort of faded a little bit in recent years, but certainly around 2014, 2015, 2016, this area Rojava that it was called, was almost anarchic, but in a positive way. And was this sort of this experiment in local democracy and community democracy, and was very, very high on dealing with sort of gender equality, for example, and things like that. So, we've actually got this really, really interesting experiment that's gone on. And so this has also created the really big question that I think a lot of people are looking at. So yes, you've got the other communities. So what do you do with the Alawite areas? You've got a Christian community and things. So you'd be sort of thinking any restructuring of Syria, you would certainly hope that it's going to embed those sort of minority and religious rights. And that's a huge question with this new, with HTS and their background and their hardline sort of Islamist agenda that certainly they had in the past, whether they'll continue with that. But in terms of, in terms of a geographical, political creation of Syria, then you've got this area of the Kurds, which is the really, really key area. Now, I think what's important to note at the moment is that the first indications seem to be that the Kurdish areas are saying we are part of Syria and we fully intend to remain part of Syria. So there's been reports, for example, they've been raising the Syrian, the new old Syrian flag in their areas. The leaders there have been speaking very positively about remaking Syria. They've welcomed the revolution that's taken place, but also called for a democratic transition and an open society for all the citizens of Syria. So it's been quite interesting to see that they are sending in the message at the moment that they're not planning on trying to break away or taking advantage of the situation. But they're also sending a very clear message not to mess with their particular status that they've created for themselves. So I think it's very clear that in any discussions about the future of Syria, they are going to be adamant that they want to maintain their autonomy. Now, the question is whether that's autonomy or whether a lighter form of autonomy or a more federalized form of autonomy, or perhaps confederation, as you mentioned, which would be a fascinating option.
Can you explain that to me?
So there's all sorts of debates about federation and confederation and what it means, and you have federations that call themselves confederations and confederations that call themselves federations. Essentially, the idea is that federation, simply put, is it tends to be territorially based, and the federal units, you have a single overarching sovereignty of the country, but the federal units have a lot of power within that and a lot of self-rule. A confederation tends to be a looser form of structure. So in more recent terms, for anyone who might follow from the Balkans, a really interesting example to my mind of a confederation was the state union between Serbia and Montenegro, which eventually broke apart. It lasted only for 3 or 4 years or something, but that was much more of a confederation where they actually had some degree of coordination at a central level, but effectively they were existing as two separate countries with a single international broad personality. But they even at that point they were doing a lot in terms of foreign policy in their own ways. So that sort of is a potential model that we would see, that you'd have a single Syria, but the Kurds would have extensive ability to do their own thing, not only internally, but even to a degree externally. So that's going to be a question of how does Syria reinvent itself? So
if I can interject, if I could just ask a sort of a follow-up, or sort of offer an alternative example. So when the Ethiopian Tigray war was occurring in 2020 to 22, I've just begun my new position at International Crisis Group, and one of the first things I was covering from the UN perspective was that, because it completely threw the entire Security Council and situation into disarray. But I really became passionate, also because I'd lived in nearby and I've been to Addis Ababa before, and the country is a fascinating for people who've never been or are interested in sort of what the scramble of Africa did to various nation states. Ethiopia, arguably speaking, was the first and only African country not to be colonized fully. The Italians tried, and it sort of, well, they messed it around, right? But Ethiopia is this incredible concoction of different, what they call nationalities, right? Not races or ethnicities, but nationalities. And the Tagaru people are a very autonomous group that live in the northwest part of the country, but they only account for about 6-7% of the Ethiopian population, whilst the Oromos and the Amharas collectively, I think, reach about 40-45% of the different groups down there. And I believe it's Article 49 in the Constitution of Ethiopia, which says, you know, you could potentially seek succession if you so wish, if it works. Things. But the reason I'm adding all this is because, you know, what Abiy Ahmed wanted to do was centralize control more in the federal government, and that's what led to the fighting with the TPLF, because the TPLF governed Ethiopia for 30 plus years or so, and they were fighting for that greater autonomy. So using that as a blueprint, James, could we see the Kurds try to push for that greater autonomy, even though I appreciate they've got a fair amount of autonomy as it stands in the northeast? Could we see a resemblance of that happening and Syria descends into civil war, but along these new lines?
Well, I think, you know, yes and no. I mean, Ethiopia has a very particular history, and you were very right to point out. I mean, you know, Ethiopia was just one of 4 African states which were founder members of the UN. I mean, along with Egypt, Liberia, and South Africa. And you're right. I mean, you know, wasn't colonized. In fact, Liberia was, I think, the other one that was never formally colonized in the scramble for Africa. But yeah, I mean, you know, and you're right, Ethiopia is this patchwork, and it's very unusual. It's one of the only countries in the world which does have a constitutional provision that allows for secession. But of course, like so many of these other cases, yeah, try and do it. And you will find that, you know, so it exists, this right on paper, but when you actually want to try and do it, and, you know, this was, as you said, one of the points that was put together with Tigray. Where I would draw a difference, though, with what we're seeing in Syria is that, so Ethiopia has this constitution that, you know, it had a military government, it was overthrown, and they put in place a new constitution. And what it sort of embedded in now that sort of created this, what we're talking about in the case of Syria is that there is going to presumably have to be a new constitution that's put together. And this is going to be the subject of quite serious debate, I would imagine, from the Kurdish communities to say, okay, what is going to be our status, and whether there is, you know, there's going to be pushback from the other parties, and especially HTS. Is it going to accept this? And, you know, it comes back to that original point that, you know, for this to work quite well, you're going to need a much more sort of democratic structure for the country. And how's that going to be put in place? But then you get on to one other absolutely crucial factor in this whole discussion, which is Turkey. And Turkey is extremely nervous about any formalization of any sort of Kurdish entity in northeast Syria. You know, as many people watching will know, you know, you've covered it, I've covered it. You know, Turkey has been fighting. I mean, this year marks, in fact, the 40th anniversary of the start of the PKK conflict in Turkey, which was essentially based off the idea that the Kurds in the southeast, you know, had suffered sort of discrimination and started to push back against it. And the PKK was campaigning for an independent Kurdish homeland in southeast Turkey. They've now moderated their views. They call for greater autonomy and everything like that. But to Turkey in particular, especially as the forces in northeast Syria, Turkey says are basically offshoots of the PKK. So it's extremely nervous about this idea that you're going to have some sort of autonomous unit, that especially if that then sort of declares independence and maybe then becomes, you know, the unit upon which southeast Turkey will want to sort of attach itself into a greater Kurdistan. So Ankara is going to, I would imagine, is going to be, and it already invaded Syria during the civil war in order to curb Kurdish ambitions and keep them down. I think you're going to see Turkey putting a lot of pressure on the new administration in Damascus, to reining any sort of Kurdish ambitions, and that will create the tensions, because the Kurds will then, what happens then if the Kurds are saying, well, look, our price for signing up to this is that we keep our autonomy, and the Kurds are saying, and the Turks are saying, no, you can't do that. What happens then? So that really, I think, for many people who are watching this situation, is going to be a real question for where things go in the future. And is this going to be, potentially a source of tension as well? Because, if the Kurds don't agree, if Turkey's putting a lot of pressure on Damascus to do this, then, will Turkey just simply say, right, okay, in that case, we're going to remain in northern Syria, and the tensions that could run between Turkey and Damascus on that issue. So, this is a really, really complex area, and it has all sorts of potential to explode into something far, far more serious.
Yeah, I'm very concerned. No, I'm still very apprehensive about it. I'm delighted that Assad is gone, but I think what people on X obviously they jumped to the typical conclusion that because you see the end of one dictator, that means you sort of you support anarchy and statelessness of the state. No, I'm not endorsing or vying for a Libya 2.0. I think it was the worst thing for Western interventionism that led to the destabilization of Libya. But that doesn't mean I don't support Assad being gone, right? I just hope that Syria can proceed to be a more stable, positive version of Libya, right? And I think this leads me to a couple more questions for this session, which is sort of, demographic size is important here. The Kurds control, as I said at the start of our stream, about 35%, 40% of the territory. And they are a very well-oiled, shall we say, military entity. And they are supported by the US at the moment, though. So sort of related to the Kurds is two-pronged points. I'd appreciate your perspective, which is, one, how much does demographic size play into the ability for a country to be self-governed? Such as, say, look at Somaliland. Trump has insinuated he might even recognize Somaliland as a breakaway country from Somalia, but they only have a population of 80, 90,000. It's tiny. I
think it's sort of bit more than that, but yeah, but point well taken. That you do. That is obviously a whole different debate, but
because Somaliland is obviously it's a country that has everything that exists to be a country. It has a currency. It has it has a US consulate in DC, for goodness sake. I've been there. So, could we see so how easy can it be for the Kurds to govern more autonomously despite their population size? And related to that, with Trump coming in and the US deciding to change its relationship with Syria and the Kurds, therefore, I'm not pretending to say how, but just something's going to change. What do you think that could do for the Kurds and their relationship to Turkey and the Syrian government?
So here we're getting into, I think fascinating questions of sort of, the old proverbial pieces on the chessboard, because then you could see, for example, Israel could be very keen to promote in Washington the idea of a Kurdish area and saying, look, this is the best opportunity to push back against the resurgence of Syria in this sort of, especially if, HTS seems to be getting a foothold and there's real concerns about, an Islamist agenda coming out. And what you often actually see is that many Kurds sort of pin their hopes on Israel and sort of being able to say, look, we, as Kurds, we tend to be Muslim, but we're not Arab. And we haven't got that beef with Israel that the Arab states do have. And so I think then you get into a really interesting debate about, and obviously there's a lot of attention at the moment as to what Israel is doing in Syria, and the whole question about whether there can be negotiations at some point. I mean, it's not going to happen immediately, and maybe not even medium term, but there are questions about Israel's relationship with Syria. But you've got this Kurdish issue, and it might well be that there are voices in Washington which are also saying, well, look, the Kurds have served us well as allies in the battle against ISIS in eastern Syria. We should be we should be engaging with them. We should be recognizing and rewarding that. And it's quite interesting, as you mentioned, about Somaliland, that this is something that's come onto the agenda. So could it well be, could it be the case that you're going to have those same voices saying, well, look, maybe we should be recognizing the Kurdish areas? That will cause huge frictions in the relationship with Turkey. And one of the other questions at the moment, of course, is what is the US relationship going to be with Turkey? There's a lot of concern in recent years about the direction that Turkey's been taking. It's obviously a NATO member, but it certainly hasn't been regarded as a team player for a number of years. We saw that, for example, on Finnish and Swedish membership of NATO, where Turkey was blocking it, again, partly because of, predominantly because of the PKK issue, certainly in the case of Sweden. So will the new Trump administration say, well, look, do we try and rebuild relations with Turkey, or whether it just comes in and says, no, we can't trust Ankara anymore, and so we're not really going to go listening to their concerns. We will engage with the Kurds, especially if, as I say, if Israel is pushing that agenda. So there are all these complex factors that are playing here, which it makes it really, really difficult to make any sort of immediate assessment as to where we're going. We can ask the questions, we can highlight the points that we should all be looking out for, but I'm very wary of anyone who can sort of say definitively that they have the answer at this stage, because there's just too much complexity there. And we're dealing with, the fag end of the Biden administration at the moment, and everything's sort of hinging on what happens when Trump comes in. And we just don't know what sort of positions they're going to be taking on all of this.
But James, but that's why we're having the live stream. You're supposed to know. I'm asking you all these questions.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Here I am. It's sort of like, yeah, exactly. But
just joking, everybody.
It's just, you can't. I mean, it really is one of those sort of moments when you have to just sort of almost take a Socratic view on this and sort of say, there are things that you just don't know, and just throw your hands up in the air and say, but these are the moments that you've got to be asking the right questions, and you've got to know what you don't know. If you see what I mean.
I agree. I mean, I personally, not that I think it works for every situation, but I personally think that a country which can have certain regions that are more autonomous, so a looser construction, right? You have the centralized government that manages defense, foreign policy, things like that, transnational issues, but then you've got these regional areas which have greater autonomy on things that they understand affect them in a very different way to, say, their neighbor, right? So I don't know, for example, well, when Catalonia and the prime minister of Catalonia arbitrarily in 20, I remember I just started my master's degree, and one of the courses I had to take as a core component was about statecraft and sort of related to, it was strategic studies, right? And then you've got the nutter guy who's like, no, we're going to leave Spain. You what? And then genius, where does he fly? He flies to Belgium to try and get away from being, and then why would you fly to another EU state, which will just indict you and send you back to Spain? He's an idiot. Anyway, so that was really interesting. But I think that I can imagine a scenario whereby Syria it has the central government in Damascus, but a bit of it is, the sort of the northwestern part around Idlib and its relationship with Turkey has a bit more autonomy. And then the eastern part with the Kurds have that more autonomy. So you do have this sort of tripart or tricolor or sort of patchwork of different areas which have semi-autonomy, but as a way to try to appease Turkey and a couple of regional actors that maybe have influence internally. I don't know. I'm not pretending I have the crystal ball here, but I feel that it would be the most smooth ability to ensure that Syria is still an independent state and doesn't just become some archaic place like Afghanistan, but it also sort of appeases or balances the influences that come from around it, depending upon which powers you're talking about.
And you can have complex asymmetrical models. So, you know, for example, we would think of the United States as being a very formalized federation where there is sort of nominal equality between the states. I mean, obviously, Rhode Island and California are very different in terms of size and things, and there's sort of some states are wealthier than others, but essentially on paper, you know, there is this equality. Whereas, you know, you've got other models where it's much less structured. The United Kingdom is a really good example of that.
Yes.
That in many ways has certain features about it which are very federal, but others it sort of varies. So Scotland would have more powers than Wales, and you know Northern Ireland's powers are very different, and status in some ways, and becoming even more so after Brexit, is very different. So you could actually have something like that emerges in Syria. So for example, you could have a federal structure which says, look, this is the main area that is well, one part of it, which is predominantly Arab and Sunni, but you've got this Kurdish area in the northeast, which is the other part of the federation. But then you can offer another area, a degree of self-rule, but it isn't formally part of the federation, but it could be an autonomous province within, you know, you get to it. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be territorially based. So you could, for example, say to the Christians, you know, that it isn't that they have their own area, if you like, but they have specific rights granted under the constitution. So, for example, the right to organize their own religious affairs, the right to organize their own educational affairs. You know, you can see how that. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways that you can deal with these sort of situations. It doesn't have to be very you know, formulaic. It doesn't have to be that every different community has equality within it. You can actually, you know, or no, equality under the law, yes, for all citizens, but they don't all have to have the same sort of equal structures and setup. So you can do a lot in these situations if you've got the political will. My concern is that there isn't that political will, that very sort of democratic approach, which is absolutely required to make these things work. I mean, you know, you can have them in other cases, but it then becomes that the will of the powerful leader, you know, who might then say, right, okay, I'm going to give these different groups or a degree of autonomy because it's a divide and rule for keeping society together, if you like, or certainly keeping their control over society. So you can actually have it imposed from the top, but for more nefarious purposes. But if you want it to really work, then, as I say, it's got to be underpinned by sort of a more democratic structure. And then you start getting into other questions as to, you know, trying to embed that. We've seen just how difficult it is.
Yeah, well, democratization of Middle Eastern states is very precarious.
Democratization in lots of states, yeah.
Yeah, trying to attempt secularism. I mean, well, Lebanon is something that people raise as an example where you have this unique makeup of secularism but tied with religion, and it sort of works. But it works because Lebanon, well, unfortunately, the country in itself is in a terrible state, unfortunately, and has been struggling for years at this point. But it up until that point, it works also because I don't think enough people account for size, right? When this is slightly off topic, but the tangent is the same point applies, which is basically, you know, how you get those indexes like happiest country, safest country, most balanced country, and it's always the Nordic states and Iceland. Yeah, okay. Try to replicate the policies that Iceland can undertake with a population of 330,000 in a country like America with 330 million. It's not that simple. So you can't just pick up the same policies and apply, like, you know, universal healthcare or public access to education. I think everyone should have certain public goods, but like, so the point is, maybe it works in Lebanon because Lebanon's not exactly a massive country. Syria, which has a population of 5 times the size or something like that, you know, significantly 22 million versus a few million in Lebanon. So the replication, if that's the right word, or replicating it in other states is, well, yeah, it's not that easy. But then the last question I kind of wanted to bring in is, obviously this isn't just a case of we've got Turkey and maybe the situation in Syria is complicated enough. But now Israel is doing, Benjamin Netanyahu is doing stuff. I'm going to put it that way, right? I saw on the news earlier, AFP had reported that they are considering doubling the size of the Golan Heights population. Not entirely sure what that meant, but it seems to me like the Israelis want to sit and occupy more of the Golan Heights around, is it Mount Hernon, for longer than they initially suggested they would. I don't know if that is true, but if that were to happen, James, what does that mean for Syria's political transition and stability? Setting aside whether or not Israel can do it, I'm not going into the.
No, I mean, you're absolutely. I mean, Israel moved in very, very quickly, and this has led to accusation that it's been exploiting the situation for its own interests. And I think there could certainly be an element of that. I mean, the Israeli position would be, well, look, we're pleased to see the back of Assad, but the new lot have a very, very disturbing past. And so we're going to take steps to make sure that we can protect Israel's security until we've got a clearer picture about what they're going to do. Now, the counter to that would be, well, yeah, but even if they were in any way predisposed to, if not reaching out to Israel in a positive way, at least just saying, well, look, we will ignore Israel for the meantime. You've now gone and blown that by marching in and making it more sort of politically sensitive. And both sides just going to stick to the position at the moment that, the Israelis will say, well, we had to do this. This was, we had to protect our interests and everything. And the other side will say this is absolutely unacceptable violation. But the key question here we have, of course, is, as you mentioned, the Golan Heights, which was seized by Israel during the 1967 war, and then annexed at the start of the 1980s. An annexation, by the way, that was condemned by the UN Security Council. But rather interestingly, under the previous Trump administration, the United States has recognized the Golan Heights now as Israeli territory. It caused a huge, this was one of those sort of really disruptive things that Trump did in his first term that everyone's now nervous about what it's going to mean in the second term. There are these concerns. Is Israel actually sort of going to try and extend its control over the Golan Heights into more areas? But even if that isn't the case, the fact is, for Syria, this is important territory. For Israel, it's important strategic territory. It's very difficult to see how you're going to have a dialogue between the two. And unless you can get a dialogue over the Golan Heights, it seems very difficult to see that you're ever going to get to a lasting peace between Israel and Syria. So is this a question that we could potentially see Israel back off at some point? We do have a precedent, by the way, for Israel moving that, not that it annexed, if memory serves me right, but the Sinai that Israel had seized from Egypt. I'm of a certain age that, being particularly politically minded even as a child, sort of, the news debates about, Israel and the Sinai in the 1970s. And Israel eventually did withdraw from it. And that was part of the deal for peace with Egypt. It was a huge part of it. So whether the Golan Heights will also be something that Israel at the moment, I think it's difficult to see it under Netanyahu, but maybe a future Israeli government. But they will own it. This is such a strategic area. It's Golan Heights, because they're high up, and it provides vital strategic territory. So Israel says, well, this is how we defend the rest of Israel against any possible encroachment from Syria. And so we aren't willing to give it back to Syria, or certainly won't be willing to give it back unless we feel that there's some sort of guarantee that this, we are going to have a lasting peace with Syria in the same way that we've had a lasting peace with Egypt. So this actually is going to be a fascinating question as well, in amongst all those other questions that we've been talking about internally for Syria. But this question about how they could potentially build up relations with Israel, and it's going to be, I think, what we've seen this past week or two with Israel moving in has probably made that even more difficult than it would have been. But again, Israel would argue, well, we weren't going to take that risk.
So I want to ask one last question, and it's sort of more on the international law side, which is when I'll show the is it this one? No, yeah, that one. So this, if you can see this here, so in international law or humanitarian law specifically, right? From my research and understanding, what Israel did by well, going into the Mount Hernon and taking out some of those chemical sites and infrastructure was preemptive self-defense, right? Because they were preemptively trying to, well, their argument is that they are doing this to attack those sites so that HTS and the others can't potentially use them as a weapon source against Israel in the future. What's your interpretation of that? Is this spectrum a little bit too basic? I don't know how much you know about punitive or preventative self-defense, but sort of, you know, does that legitimize Israel's claim to doing so? Or does it fall into the brackets that the Israelis are really pushing the boat out with international law and in some ways are breaching it? I know that's a
I mean, this is
controversial
one of
question.
those areas that, you know, where you're coming from is going to define where, you know, the position you're going to take. And so there are going to be those who will say, well, yeah, we feel that it's perfectly legitimate and right to have acted in the way that we have, because we can see that there is a new regime in place and it's led by people who have been, you know, expressed views in the past which are vehemently opposed to, you know, the existence of Israel. But then you would have others would say, but this was something that was illegal. I mean, moving in beyond into the buffer zone, for example, bombing lots of sites and things. This is an act of aggression. So again, you're not going to get an answer that, you know, it depends on which side you're coming from on this. My view would be that, you know, this you know, while I can understand potentially a political you know, position on this, you know, I think legally it's you
Well,
know,
it's illegal, surely.
mildly on very contentious territory. But
Right.
I would say that this was probably unfortunate that Israel had done that. But, you know, and I think there will also be people who would, you know, and we need to be very honest about this, that, you know, Netanyahu has not been showing a lot of respect for international law. You know, and again, they would say, but we've done everything, you know, in terms of self-defense. But at some point you say, well, you know, if you're using self-defense to take such actions, then
You're
yeah.
much more diplomatic than me in that I fully understand Israel's perspective of why it reacted in the way that it did to October 7th, but I do not support the Netanyahu government, I'm very specific here, at all.
Yeah.
I think that they have completely overstretched and overdone certain actions there. I think their behavior in Lebanon has been...
Well, I mean, it's building up, and it is something. I mean, maybe, you know, for another discussion, but I mean, certainly, you know, for example, there was a International Court of Justice ruling over the course of the summer, which I don't know how many people were aware of it, but it was very significant because effectively it said that Israel has been illegally annexing the West Bank, and that touches on ideas of two-state solutions and how you put that into place. You know, we've seen all the cases about what's been going on in Gaza and the accusations of genocide, and, you know, the UN, the International Court of Justice, again, not directly saying that genocide has been committed. It's considering that question, but certainly saying that from what it's seen from Israel's actions, there is a good argument to say that potentially genocide is being committed. So, you know, again, that's judges being very, very careful, but that's quite a strong statement in its own way.
Yeah. And I've been very critical and acknowledging of the UNRWA, you know, infiltration that Hamas did do. I think that that's absolutely terrible. But, you know, I think when it comes to Israel and Syria, I could definitely, I don't know if you'd agree with this as we probably wind down. Any last thoughts from you, James? But I'm pretty sure we would see a creation or establishment of relations between Syria and Israel. Why? Because Trump wants to build on the Abraham Accords, but also because it's I don't think even if the Syrian government would be, I don't know, tense with the Israelis, I'm not sure that they would be as extreme with Bashar al-Assad's opinion or stance, right? Again, I'm sort of projecting here, obviously, but forecasting. But I don't know. I feel like that is a possibility in this Trump administration, and therefore that might influence. And also because Israel has taken out those sites, the military sites. Okay, and in law of war, that is kind of understandable. But to sit and then still contain even more of the areas of southwestern Syria than they already do with the Golan Heights, it's for me, it's pushing it. So I can agree with them in certain areas, but on other things I'm not so sure. If they do eventually relinquish the Golan Heights and those areas that they've since taken now, once those relations with Syria were sort of established, then that would be a good thing to see. But again, there's a lot of ifs, not buts, here, and unknown. So I don't know. Any final thoughts on everything we've discussed today?
Well, I think we just come back down to the point that we are at a moment when so many routes are open, and there are so many questions that need to be answered. And again, it's about charting that out and sort of thinking ahead. How are all these cards going to fall, and are they going to fall into place? It's just an incredibly confused situation, but there are sort of wider implications, as I say, about how the international community is going to engage with Syria now. You've got lots of different competing factions which are going to sort of come into this. That everyone's talking about Russia and Iran are the big losers in this, but you can also see potential areas where they might be able to turn it around. So there's not going to be a lot of love lost between Russia and HTS, or Iran and HTS. But on the other hand, HTS might turn around if the Russians are willing to engage with them in the way that the West aren't. Then, and I think Russia will be going all out on an offensive on that regard of saying, listen, you know what, let us keep those bases and we will engage with you. I think there's also the question of Tehran as well, that sort of, are we in a situation where HTS might be so opposed to Israel that they would say, well, we're not happy that Tehran gave Assad all that support, but if Tehran and Russia are willing to be our friends when the West aren't, then maybe we should be pursuing that relationship and maintaining it. So, there is a lot of interest that's going to be sort of at play here, and it's really not as clear cut as people saying, well, you know what, it was, Russia and Iran are the big losers, and so the West are going to be, it's going to be so much more difficult and complex than that. And of course, we get back to that question. I said, how are the Arab countries going? I think, in many ways, these are the key things. And you mentioned about Somaliland. In many ways, what we talk about in Somaliland is how the African countries are going to engage with it, because the Western position has been, if the African countries recognize it, we'll go along with that. So the question for Syria is, if the Arab countries are willing to engage with it and recognize it, then maybe that's going to be the door that the Western countries are going to take. But you're right, it could come with certain prices as well, in terms of democratization, how you deal with the Kurds, but also the question of Israel. And I think Israel will certainly be a big factor in all of this, especially for Washington.
Absolutely. And I think, some people have made the reoccurring point, which is, I'll just use unknown as an example, but is Sykes-Picot coming to an end, right? For
Yes.
brief context, people, that was the arbitrarily drawn lines, which obviously it's always the British, or largely the British and the French. And to be fair, the Turks did have something to do with this, I think, or the Ottomans. So, could we see a large redrawing of the Middle Eastern map? I don't know if we're going to go that far. I think nation states have largely become quite established with their main lines of, drawn up lines. But I do support, I think I'm more in the favor of self-determination if it means people have the opportunity to be more expressing of themselves and their identity. I do think that that's something I support. Not maybe complete, new nation state creation. Like, I don't really want to see the dissolution of the UK. I think that would be quite sad. But at the same time, if enough Northern Irish want to sort of unify with the Republic of Ireland, then fair enough. Times change, but yeah, I hope that, largely speaking, in this chat, it's been fascinating to have more of a sort of academic one or conceptual. And I hope that, Syria can come out of this, if there can be let's say all the stars line, and it's the best case scenario, right? That Syria establishes relations with Israel. Israel pulls out of those areas because it doesn't feel it's under threat anymore. Syria can help stabilize Lebanon by extension, but ultimately the government in Syria can help begin to take on Tehran even more. This is such a bad situation for the Islamic Republic, and I'd love to see nothing more than the mullahs to be taken down as well. But anyway, that's a further afield situation, I think. So anyway, on that rather sort of idealistic note, as I often do, James, thank you very much for your time. Again, it's always a pleasure streaming with you. And speaking, everyone, if you aren't yet a member of James's community, I encourage you to go and join it, because him and I are quite similar. He's much more perhaps refined in his delivery. As you probably see, I'm a bit more rough around the edges, but James is very much, we cover similar things, and we don't strictly stay on just Ukraine or just China. We try to cover lots of different things, forgotten conflicts, as I call them, like Sudan or Myanmar. And it's always a pleasure to talk to him on the internet, on the YouTube. So yes, I would encourage you to go and support him. He does awesome stuff. And if you're from James' community and you liked what I did in terms of hosting and chatting with James, then come over to me and listen. I'm joking, but anyway, I'm not very good at plugging. I'm too English for that. But thanks, guys. Appreciate you. James, any final thoughts? Anything you want to share with the community?
No. Have a very good evening, everyone.
Yeah, very good evening. Potential happy Christmas if I don't do this before.
Yes.
I'll actually be streaming for the next month. I'll be in Latin America. So if any of you are from that region, I welcome any suggestions. I'm traveling to 3 or 4 different countries, and I'll still be trying to record videos and post stuff. I'll probably be streaming with James at some point, but we'll see. Anyway, guys, thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll speak to you soon. And as always, we like to say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone.